Hello everyone, and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival. The DIF is an online open access event that brings together all kinds of people to explore the question, the economy is changing, what do I need to know, experience and do? In today's session, we will be discussing astrophysics, existential threats and science fiction with Lord Martin Rees. Please share your comments and your questions throughout the session. We will take them in the second part of the session. For that, there are two options. Either you can write your comments and your questions directly under the video, or you can have access to a Q&A app by clicking the link in the corner of the video. So Martin Rees is the Astronomer Royal and is Professor of Cosmology and Astrophysics at the University of Cambridge. He's the recipient of a number of awards, including the Gold Medal of the Royal Astronomical Society. He's also, for over 10 years, been exploring the implications and the prevention of catastrophic threats. He co-founded the Center for the Study of Existential Risks at the University of Cambridge. The Financial Times recently described him as one of the great polymaths of contemporary physics. So Martin, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So most of your scientific career has been in the field of astronomy and cosmology. Could you share with us what have been your greatest interests?
Well, I've been lucky to have been in the subject at a time of exciting change, because the space programs allowed us to probe the planets, to send telescopes up in space, and we've discovered a huge amount about the universe, about how it began and how it evolved, how the first stars and galaxies formed, and how it's going to evolve in the future. I think if I was to pick out one thing which is of the greatest interest to most of the people I talk to, it's the discovery that dates back just 20 years now, that other stars have planets orbiting around them, just like the sun has the Earth and the other familiar planets. And this makes the night sky much more interesting. When you look up at the stars, they're not just points of light anymore. You can think of each one as being a planetary system with planets, and we suspect that there are 1 billion planets like the Earth elsewhere in our Milky Way galaxy. And then, of course, everyone asks the question, is there life on any of those? We don't know. We don't really know how life began on the Earth, but it's quite likely that there is at least some kind of life on some of these planets. And I think in 10 or 20 years, we may know the answer to that. We know whether there's simple life. We may, if we're very lucky, find evidence for intelligent life, but I'm not holding my breath for that. It'll be a long time before we can ever visit these planets around other stars. It would take thousands of years to get there. But of course, we are exploring our own solar system, Mars, Jupiter, and the other planets.
Okay, that's really interesting. I saw you also recently have been interested in the anthropic principle and the idea of the multiverse. Can you explain these ideas for our audience and tell us your position?
Well, this is rather speculative, because one thing we've learned is that everything we see in the universe, all the galaxies, and we can see billions of galaxies with a big telescope, each of them like our Milky Way, each containing 100 billion stars. And these galaxies are all the aftermath of the so-called Big Bang, a hot, dense beginning 13.8 billion years ago. We have very good evidence that everything started off in this hot, dense state. We can calculate what it was like when it was a millisecond old. So we understand this. But that really raises the question, is this Big Bang the only one? We've learnt that our solar system isn't the only planetary system. We've learnt that our galaxy is just one of billions. So maybe our Big Bang is one of billions too. And if that's the case, then we have a far grander concept of physical reality, far grander than what we can observe with our telescopes. We can imagine that there are, at unobservable distances, other cosmoses, which are the aftermath of other Big Bangs. And then we wonder if these other Big Bangs are governed by the same basic laws as ours. They could be replicas of ours, but they could be different. It could be that in some of them, gravity is much stronger or weaker, chemistry is very different, etc. And so one of the fascinating questions is, are these counterfactual ideas just speculations, or could it be that out there somewhere there are universes governed by quite different physical laws?
Yeah.
We don't know the answer, but here again, this is a challenge for 21st century physics to try and understand the basic laws, and whether what we call the laws of nature, which apply to all the things we see, are in this grander concept just parochial bylaws in our cosmic patch, and there's some deeper reality that underlies a far vaster reality.
I find it always fascinating to think that in the 19th century, some physicists thought we had pretty much uncovered most of the laws of physics, and that was before general relativity or quantum physics, or now some of these big questions that are still completely open today. What are some of the other, do you think, big unknowns today in science?
Well, absolutely. You're quite right in saying that in about 1900, people thought that they'd never understand any more than they did then. But they were under-ambitious because they didn't really understand very much about things. They didn't understand why different solids have different colors and different properties. They didn't understand very much about the wider universe. And of course, as you say, we had two big breakthroughs in the first half of the 20th century. Einstein's work on gravity and space and time, and the understanding of the quantum principle, which underlies all of atomic physics, all of chemistry, and is the basis of all modern technology. Clearly, we've made huge progress in those two areas. But I think, as you imply, we have to ask, are there many things that we don't yet understand or aren't even yet aware of? It's clear there are many things we don't understand. We don't understand the origin of life. We understand the evolution of life from simple beginnings to complex animals like ourselves by Darwinian selection over 4 billion years. But we still don't understand the basic question of how the first life formed, what made the transition between complex chemistry and the first replicating, metabolizing systems that we call alive. And that's a basic challenge for chemistry. And biology is a much harder subject than physics and chemistry. And so there are lots of things we don't understand. And one thing we certainly don't understand yet is the human brain, which is the most complicated thing we know about in the universe. And we are only just beginning to understand that. So the way I think of science is that it's got sort of frontiers inside which we are fairly confident we have understanding, and outside which we just don't know at all. As the frontiers advance, their periphery gets longer, so there are more new questions that come up all the time. And certainly in my own subject, over the time I've been doing it, I've seen that many of the questions that were very controversial when I started, like, was there a Big Bang, have been settled. But the questions we're posing now couldn't even have been posed 10, 20 years ago. And so I hope that 20 years from now, we'll have settled those and gone still further on. But I think we've got to accept that science is an unending quest, and there's a huge amount that remains to be discovered. This raises another interesting philosophical question, which is whether our brains are up to understanding all these things. I think we may come up against a brick wall or hit the buffers, as it were, because there may be some concepts which are important to a full understanding of the physical world, but which our brains can't grasp. Just as a monkey can't understand quantum theory, there's no particular reason why our brains, which have emerged to cope with life in the everyday world, and for our ancestors on the African savannah tens of thousands of years ago, and the brains haven't changed much since. There's no particular reason why those brains should be capable of understanding everything about the cosmos. It's rather amazing we've got as far as we have in understanding the counterintuitive world of the quantum micro scale and the cosmos, but there may be things we don't yet understand. And there, of course, one asks the question, will the machines take over? Because there are obviously limits to the capacity of the sort of wet hardware in human skulls, and maybe those can be surpassed by advanced machines. And the rate of development of machine intelligence, machine learning, is such that some people think it'll only be 30 or 40 years before we have machines which exceed human capacity. And maybe we can start to understanding these things that we can't yet understand? That's a fascinating question.
Yeah, absolutely.
And philosophically interesting, because we have to ask, would these entities be conscious? Would they have self-awareness, or would they just be zombies?
Zombies with more advanced understanding than humans.
Right, yes, and therefore rather scary.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, would you mind speaking a bit more about artificial intelligence? I know that's one of the topics you've discussed in some of your
Yes.
thinking around the big threats. What do you see as both the big opportunities and the big threats that this development could present?
Yes. Well, in all technologies, we can predict the direction of travel, but not the rate of travel. I mean, sometimes technologies catch on very fast. Mobile phones, an example. Sometimes very slowly. Supersonic civilian flight, another example. And everyone realizes that computers are getting more and more powerful, more and more capable. We don't know how long it'll be before they attain human capabilities. Some say it'll be 30 years, some say it'll be centuries. But it is amazing what's happening now. Obviously, we're well aware of the fact that in our mobile phones, we've got far more computer power than a supercomputer had in the 1980s. Huge advances. And we know that robots can do pretty clever things already. And there's development in what's called generalized machine learning. For instance, there's a company called DeepMind in London, and its boss, Demis Hassabis, is one of the advisors to our new centre. And what that company did was it programmed a machine so that without being told the rules, it could understand any of the old Atari computer games. And having figured out what the rules were, it could then play them better than any human. And that's an important step because it was not actually given the details. It worked things out for itself. And things like that and machine translations and the sort of dialogue you can have with machines indicates that they're advancing very fast. There's still a long way to go, of course, not only in intelligence, but of course in robots still being rather clumsy. I mean, for instance, it's 20 years since a computer beat the world chess champion Kasparov, but you still can't make a robot that can move around the pieces on a real chessboard as adeptly as a 5-year-old kid can. So there's a long way to go before robots have human generalized capabilities, but that'll happen one day. And of course, we then have to make sure that these things don't get out of control. And the sorts of worries that people address are the twofold. First, that a robot may be given a go, be given instructions, but may not have common sense. To give a simple example, we can imagine a kitchen robot which can make sure your fridge is stocked up and cook you a meal for when you come home. But you've got to teach it that if it's run out of meat, it's not appropriate to put the cat in the oven. That's something which any human realizes isn't without being told, but you've got to realize that a machine won't realize common sense things like that unless it's told. And so the danger is that if computers can follow up some sort of goal or task, they'll follow it blindly without having the obvious inhibitions which are bred into us as humans. So that's one danger. And of course, the other danger is that the Internet of Things, which is going to pervade everything, is going to allow a machine to possibly take over more of the actual physical world. And so there are dangers. And for that reason, people like the workers at DeepMind are concerned that there should be appropriate regulation of how they develop their technologies, just as, for instance, people doing biology and doing experiments on viruses know you have to have some regulation. Some things you can do, some things you can't do. And robotics is perhaps getting to that stage. But it's a very exciting development, of course. The two things I'd like to say about robots. The first is that, of course, we're now familiar with the idea that robots are taking over lots of jobs, not just factory jobs, but sort of white-collar jobs like routine legal work, conveyancing and things like that, and maybe medical diagnosis and even doing surgical operations. They do lots of things like that. And what we've got to make sure for the health of society is that the money earned by the robots doesn't just go to a few elite people, but is redistributed to provide, in my view, more secure and dignified work for people who can do jobs that robots can't yet do, like caring for children, gardening in public parks and things of that kind. So we need to have a society where people do the things where human qualities are needed, and they're, as it were, paid for by the robots. And that's hopeful. But as someone who is keen on space science and space technology, I also think that the real arena for big robots and robotic fabricators is going to be in space, which is not a good habitat for human beings. But I can imagine within 50 years there'll be huge fabricators up in orbit building giant, very lightweight radio dishes and solar energy collectors and things like that up in space, maybe mining the asteroids or the moon to get the materials. So that's going to be wonderful, because I think space is not a comfortable environment for human beings. There's nowhere in space as comfortable even as the South Pole, so people don't really want to go there except as an adventure. But machines will be able to make things up in space, even though we may want to control what they can do on the ground.
Yeah. So besides artificial intelligence, what do you see as the other, or what have you explored as the other big trends that present both, or that might present opportunities, but also present important threats today?
Well, I think one obvious area is the environment. We know that the world population now, 7 billion, is almost certain to be around 9 billion by mid-century. And we've got to make sure that all these people can be properly fed and have access to energy, and that the gap between the developing and developed world closes. But of course, the consequence of that's going to be greater demands on resources and on energy. And then this leads to the issue of how we get that energy, and can we get it in a clean way that doesn't trigger and amplify climate change. These are going to be big issues to be confronted by people. And it's not too early to start. We have the Paris conference next month, which is going to address how we can limit climate change. And we're going to have to accelerate the development of clean energy. I'm very keen on solar, and we should even consider whether better kinds of nuclear energy are possible, because the present kinds are hugely expensive. So those are going to be a challenge, and we've got to think about the effects on the environment. We've got to be able to grow more food without using more land, and this could be done by advanced agriculture, maybe including GM, and also low-till agriculture that doesn't destroy the soil, etc. We've got to think of things like that, and also be very concerned that we don't irreversibly reduce biodiversity by mass extinctions. The great ecologist E.O. Wilson said that if our despoilation of nature leads to mass extinctions, it's the act for which future generations will least forgive us, because it's completely irreversible. And so we've got to raise public consciousness about this. And it's gratifying that young people and students who I see in this university are more concerned than their elders about these issues, understandably so, because they'll be alive at the end of the century, whereas people like me won't be. So people are getting more concerned, but it's very important that we do ensure that these rise up the political agenda. And that's very hard, because, of course, for politicians, the local trumps the global, the immediate trumps the long term, and nothing beyond the next election counts for very much. And so to get them to really adopt policies which are useful in the long run, which is environmental policies, and indeed the recycling economy, which we're promoting here. All these things are going to be crucial, and we need to get them not just as ideas among younger people, but actually fully implemented by the people who can't.
You say you work with some businesses in the center that was recently created. Do you see also beyond regulation a role for business to address some of these trends, or something that could be part of how they work?
Well, I mean, obviously, in terms of energy and agriculture, it is what happens in the business world which is going to be crucial. I mean, it's gratifying that some business leaders are mindful of these issues, and more so than their shareholders. And of course, one of the problems is that the bottom line and the quarterly reports carry too much weight with investors, and this, I think, is a big flaw in the current capitalist system. There's the myth that shareholders are the owners of companies, but really that's not the case. They don't have control over them, and so we've got to ensure that major companies do see their role as being to satisfy lots of stakeholders. And of course, many of the business leaders do this. And that's very important because we can't manage without them. And I think governments are becoming more mindful of these things. But of course, we've got to get through to the politicians. And I think there are two ways of doing this. One is by ensuring that the politicians have good advice from experts, etc. But that's limited in its effectiveness. I mean, I know from my own limited experience that you talk to politicians, and even if you give them good arguments, they don't listen. They do listen to two things. One is what's in the press, and also what's in the inbox of MPs. And so I think the best way that we can ensure that these long-term issues of the environment, the recycling economy, etc., rise up the agenda is to raise public consciousness of them, so that people send emails to the MPs about them, and they get coverage in the press. Because if they get coverage in the press, then politicians will take notice. And so that's why I think it's very important to have all these outreach activities, of which I guess what we're doing now is one, to try and get through to as many people as possible that there are these longer term concerns where we don't think about just this country in the short term, but we think about the whole world in the long term, because we are all on this crowded world together, and we need to all worry and all act together if we are to avoid these serious downsides stemming from the very heavy footprint which we are putting on the environment collectively.
Yeah. So you recently founded the Center for the Study of Existential Risk in Cambridge, which we mentioned before. Can you tell us more about what the center does?
Yes. Well, it's really a group which is concerned to address problems like the ones we've just mentioned: extreme environmental threats, threats from AI getting out of control. But another class of threats I worry about is bio threats. The fact that biotechnology is getting more and more powerful, and it's got huge potential for good in health, etc., but also can be misused and has the especially scary feature that it doesn't involve anything very elaborate in the way of equipment. It can be done in many small labs in universities and companies, and so the risk of bio-error and bioterror, I think, is very serious, more serious than the risk of terrorists building H-bombs, which they can't do without it being pretty conspicuous. These developments can happen on the quiet. So I think bio-error and bioterror is certainly something on our agenda. What we're trying to do really is to extend the sort of risk register which all companies have and all countries have towards trying to assess the extreme end of it, the extreme high consequence, low probability risks, which tend not to be worried about to the extent of more modest risks. I think we tend to fret too much about small risks, like, for instance, carcinogens in food, low radiation levels, etc. But we're in denial about these possible new risks. And an important mantra which we have is that the unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. Lots of these risks, when they're not familiar, but they may loom up as science advances, and we need to be aware of them. And the one reason I'm keen on this centre is that we're just starting up. We've got a small group of researchers who focus on these problems, but more importantly, we're in Cambridge University here, and Cambridge University has a huge range of expertise and the convening power to get experts from all around the world. And so I think we're in a good position to try and get experts to gather to assess these long-term threats, to decide which can be dismissed as science fiction and which are sufficiently possible that we ought to think about how we can guard against them today and what we can do about it. So we feel that not enough is being done to try and horizon scan for these extreme threats. And the way I put it is, even if we reduce the probability of these threats by 1 part in 10,000, we'll have earned our keep because the stakes are so high.
Great. So I have a question in what led you to do this transition? So starting as an astronomer, these are questions that are very earthbound. What led you to get so interested in them?
Well, of course, although I'm an astronomer, I'm a human being and have to live on the Earth, and so I care about the Earth and other human beings. But I think if you ask about my personal history, I was involved in nuclear disarmament campaigns and things called the Pugwash conferences in the 1980s, and was a sort of campaigner in those sorts of causes. And in fact, I got interested in other areas because, being in university, I have ready access to experts in computer science and biology, etc. So I got interested in the way these sciences were going, and I wrote a book in 2003, more than 10 years ago, called Our Final Century. And I put in a question mark, but the publisher took out the question mark, and that was really about all these threats. So I'd already started to worry about the fact that technology, in some respects, was running away out of control. We needed to be sure that it was constrained so to be used for our benefit. And that book got quite a lot of traction, and actually it was in fact quite good in some of its forecasts, but it's been out of date now. And since that time, I have been involved more in these threats. And also the way my personal career developed was that from being a professor of astronomy, I got involved in other sciences through being president of the Royal Society, which is the UK's National Academy of Sciences, which is involved in all of science and science policy and interface with government. So in that job, it was my obligation as well as a great satisfaction to get involved in these wider questions. And then I was made a member of the House of Lords 10 years ago, and that's also an opportunity to interact more with the political world. So that's the reason why my own interests, although my expertise is still limited to astronomy, I suppose, has diversified so that I am now spending a good fraction of my time on these more general questions of how we can ensure that we get to the end of a century safely.
That makes sense. We have a number of good questions coming in from the audience. Before this, I do have one more question, which is a lot of what we've talked about, and I've especially pointed out the idea of zombies with very advanced intelligence. It really sounds like good material for science fiction to me, while at the same time not being, completely dismissed as pure science fiction. But what is your view on science fiction as a genre, and do you think it has value beyond entertainment?
Well, I think it is very stimulating. I should say I'm not a great reader of science fiction because the writing and characterization